The idea of a staple card in Commander is one that is hugely interesting to me. When I say this, I'm sure what comes to mind are things like Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, and Command Tower, but also cards like Swords to Plowshares and Pongify, and going even further, the core cycle of Tutors, as well as enchantments like Rhystic Study and Smothering Tithe. These last few examples are where things get interesting. In this category, we quickly go from cards that enable you to better play your deck and achieve the game state that you had in mind when you built it, to hyper-efficient sources of removal, searching for win cons, or stacks effects that accelerate your game plan, but very much to the deficit of the rest of your pod. It's here that a problem starts to emerge. As we see more and more printings of these cards, as well as new power creep precons releasing en masse, what is casual Commander at this point? While the level of play in the format has always been a spectrum, it seems that things are drifting further and further to higher levels of play and competition faster than ever with the explosion of product support WotC has provided for the format. Hell, as it turns out, even Modern Horizons is a Commander set now, and this has always been released with very normal and reasonable card designs historically. If we look at the visual scale created by Reddit user MLLang1000 4 years ago, I think it's fair to say that new precons, particularly those found in Lost Caverns of Ixalan and Murders at Karlov Manor, take it from the person who has analysed all of them, are graduating into those 5 and 6 power levels, while representation of 1s and 2s is becoming slim to none. With the amount of focus put on Commander in recent years, both through products and associated media, it feels like it would take a conscious effort to construct a deck that could be considered a 1 in earnest. Now, I'm not one for the CEDH should be its own format take per se, but it could be seen that there are negative effects for both strains of EDH by them being lumped together. For CEDH, it lacks the ability to self-govern and determine its own card legalities, which might ideally be entirely different to the current Commander ban list, given my previous point about recent levels of power creep. It would also not be surprising for CEDH specific bans to be significantly more frequent, in line with other competitive formats, whereas there haven't been any new bans in Commander since 2021's bans of Golos Tireless Pilgrim and Hullbreacher. With the exciting levels of growth in the competitive community recently, this will likely continue to be a dialogue in 2024 and beyond. And I'm incredibly curious to see what this brings. Returning to casual Commander, the influence of CEDH muddies the waters of what should be considered for inclusion in a list for lower power pods, particularly for new players who may use tools like EDH Rec for ideas of where to start constructing their own lists for the first time. I think that there are a number of great suggestions that can be found on the site, and I usually discover a card I didn't realize existed while using it. But the mishmash of competitive and casual includes can make players feel like they have to buy big-ticket cards like Mana Crypt, Jeweled Lotus, Shocks, and Fetches for every deck they make, as well as unintentionally portraying these cards at the same level as 50p commons like Elvish Mystic. And while there is a very handy budget filter on the site, how much you spend on a deck is not inherently proportional to power level, or the slightly more complex idea of how social a deck is. It is not my or anyone else's role to police the cards people put into their decks. At the end of the day, this is a format that is more about fun than imposing restrictions on how people build or play their decks. And by the way, yes, you should try to win the game despite what some seem to think. It is just very easy for the game to become not fun for others in your pods when there is a clear imbalance in the strength of the list brought to the table. While harder to avoid given the nature of matchups in the game, it's also worth considering how certain cards and archetypes can disproportionately affect the other players at the table. Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, is pretty universally a pain in the ass, but can completely turn off landfall or blink decks, and essentially lock a player out of the game, for instance. It's for these reasons that I think there's a level of responsibility that falls on each of us as Commander players to self-reflect on the construction of our decks and how they feel at the table. Obviously, the first time you get to play a constructed deck, you're going to lack a clear idea of how it's received at the table, but you might have an idea of its potential power, given you've, hopefully, goldfished it. We're all allowed our, whoa, this deck is sick, or I actually did the thing moment, but it's worth considering the cost of this to the other players in your pods, as well as their reactions when deciding whether to play that deck again with the same people completely unchanged. To give you a personal example, I very rarely play my list for Malik Prim Manipulator with newer players or in definitively more casual games, as a forced sacrifice theme, particularly at its most realized with both Dictate of Erebos and Grave Pact out alongside a sack engine, is quite commonly a feels bad when no one's commander other than mine lasts more than a turn at the table. I confess, I have sinned. However, it's a different case altogether if someone familiar with the list actively asks to play against it, because they know what they're getting into. Conversation is the most important thing, which brings us on to our next point. The easiest way to prevent any of these negative situations is to talk about it ahead of time, in a reasonable level of detail and with openness and honesty. I understand that a lot of people get a very limited window within which to play Commander each week, if that, and the idea of spending a larger portion of that time talking doesn't appeal much. But this is by far the easiest way to improve the quality of your games, as well as the fun that everyone at the table has. The conventional perception of the Rule Zero conversation often boils down to, what's the power level of your deck? But more and more recently, this has proven to be an oversimplification, which is pretty much always relative rather than absolute. I think that while there is a value in trying to ascertain the rough power level of a deck, there is probably a lot more to gain by simply asking about the person playing it instead. What are they looking to get out of their game of Commander? It is equally acceptable for the answer to be, I want to win, or I just want to have fun. It's just more likely that both of these players will have more fun paired with others with a similar objective. From there, attempting to understand the rough power level of a deck is easier, as you have context for how that is likely to play out. And you can ask relevant questions to get an idea of the level you should be expecting to play at. What turn is their deck typically meant to win on? Is it a creature strategy or will it combo out? Are there any cards that players should watch out for? This is a particularly interesting point, as in the few decks I play with infinite combos, I always identify the pieces to my opponents if they're not aware of them already, as it can often feel deceptive to combo out, particularly against new players, if they had no idea that the cards could interact in that way. I always aim to bring a range of decks to a Commander night, as cumbersome as this can sometimes be. My higher power or more punishing lists, like Nissa, Narset, and Marnia's Calgar, are reserved for games where there is a clear intent from those at the table to win. Whereas for more fun-focused tables, I might play Cross Super Friends, my new Slime Against Humanity Zayatora deck, or one of a couple unedited precons I always make sure to bring. I'm always very open to lending decks to others who are newer or don't have more optimized decks to play, but want to try something a little bit faster. Sharing is caring. The Rule Zero conversation also gives you a great opportunity to go a little bit beyond just the game. The effort required to learn people's names and a little bit about them before and during a game is very little, but the positive impression it makes on those people is always much greater. I mean, hell, if you want to play more games, you're infinitely increasing your chances by being someone that people actively want to spend time with. It is never going to be a bad thing to encourage a greater level of dialogue around the table, as it is more often than not going to prevent players leaving unhappy with how games play out. Yes, this can be nerve-wracking with a new group or visiting a new LGS for the first time, but hopefully there will always be people willing to welcome others into their space and get more people sharing in the experience of the game we all love. So, coming back to the idea of Commander staples, my perspective is this. While there are a number of cards that are true staples and that you are likely to include in pretty much every deck they can go in, it is much more valuable to build around concepts than cards. Let's look at the classic, Sol Ring, appearing in every precon since 2011 with the exception of Dominaria Commander's Painbow. It is likely the truest staple of the format. And while obviously it's also the subject of a lot of discourse, there's a pretty good chance when you build a deck, it's one of the places you start. My thought on Sol Ring is this. Yes, the mana acceleration it provides as a turn 1 play is pretty ridiculous, but on the whole it enables a lot of decks to do the thing with a level of reliability that probably wouldn't exist otherwise in a singleton format. It's also worth considering that, along the lines that a single high-power card does not make a high-powered deck, Sol Ring alone does not make a ramp package. It is simply a faster component in this set of cards that enables you to play your deck ahead of curve. And this is what we should be considering when thinking about staples. rather than simply sticking Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, Commander Sphere, etc. in everything. If you find that your deck is playing too fast for the rest of your pod, there are slower alternatives to pretty much all of these cards. For Sol Ring, there's Worn Power Stone, Palladium Mirror, and Hedron Archive, which carries the added bonus of providing card draw when needed. From here, we're building a much more diverse package of colorless ramp, and in the spirit of the format, playing a number of cards that tend to see less play for not being efficient enough. Rather than individual cards, the concepts that I aim to build commander decks around are theme, whether that's mechanical or flavorful, ramp, card draw and tutoring, and removal. Getting slightly more fringe, I also tend to take buffs and protection, as well as recursion into account. Hearing two CEDH players in Cam and Dylan of Play to Win talk about their emphasis on theme when building casual decks was fascinating, and I highly recommend it given that their greatest sense of perspective on this comes from playing at the most competitive levels in the format. Ensuring that there is an adequate representation of each of these concepts in my list has done far more for me as a deck builder than worrying about getting a copy of Craterhoof Behemoth to put in my Nissa deck, for example. I might also subdivide these concepts as well, to ensure an even spread of the different forms of the category. For example, I like to divide card draw into one of three categories: minor/incidental, repeatable, and explosive. Minor or incidental card draw is, to me, cards that draw you one or two cards once or twice, as well as cards with other primary effects, like counterspells, that incidentally draw you a card as an additional effect. For a few examples, I like Consider in blue, Faithless Looting in red, and Corrupted Conviction in black, as well as Mishra's Bauble. White is typically worse at minor card draw, offering more incidental card draw with cards like Scroll Shift, whereas green has very little to offer in this category, echoing its themes of growth by offering primarily repeatable and explosive card draw. Repeatable card draw often comes in the form of enchantments, as well as creature and planeswalker abilities. These sources become more valuable the longer they stick around, and so should often be considered for removal. Two big stacks effects sit in this category: Esper Sentinel in white and Rhystic Study in blue, but pretty much all colours have versions of this aligned to their particular gameplay. Phyrexian Arena is a classic in black, losing you a life for an extra draw on your upkeep. Tavern Brawler is a particular favourite of mine in red, buffing your commander's power and providing impulse draw each turn, and Tribute to the World Tree provides a version of the Great Henge dependent on the creature's power on ETB. Unlike the Great Henge, it works for tokens though, which is insane. Explosive card draw is anything that offers draw en masse, normally in the form of spells that scale to some condition, like number of creatures, how much life you can pay, or how much mana you sink into them. For green, it's cards like Rishkar's Expertise and Return of the Wild Speaker, wheel effects like Windfall in blue and Wheel of Fortune in red, and depending on how brave you are, Necropotence in black. Sorry, white. That tangent aside, there are thousands of cards in Magic, and a lot of them do the same or similar things. While not every card is going to be the most efficient, it's definitely worth opening yourself up to the possibility of some bargain bin pickups that do the same as staples but for one more mana. I think Joey Schultz summarized the point I'm generally trying to make with this video best on the EDH Recast by saying, we run the risk of optimizing the fun out of our decks. While staples are important and a very good place to start when constructing your lists, they can potentially make your deck more competitive than you intended it to be, as well as reducing the charm of your overall brew because you included the same 10 to 15 cards that we see every game as a matter of course. While staple cards can often be the very solid poles propping up a tent otherwise constructed of cooked spaghetti and unfiled tax returns, every staple include further homogenizes your particular construction. Weird metaphor, I know. This video ended up being slightly chaotic, I admit, but I hope it raises some interesting points to consider and discuss with your pods the next time you sit down to play or brew a deck. Let me know in the comments below what staple cards you actively do or don't build around and why, as well as what you found to be effective points to try and cover in the Rule Zero conversation. I'd love to hear your perspectives, as well as any other random points you might have to add to this topic. Thank you as always for watching, and if you give me a +1/+1 and like and subscribe, I'll be able to tap for green. See you next time.